Greetings! It is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, your Lord and Emperor here at the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. Once again, we are diving into the world of Pathfinder today with what we're talking about. And yes, if you're joining me either live or on YouTube, or live on Twitch later on YouTube, I talk tabletop a lot and discuss things in the tabletop world. And I enjoy the lore of Golarion, the Pathfinder world. Well, that's what we're talking about today. So if you're joining me, we're going to be talking about Gnolls. And the two main societal groups of Gnolls. Gnolls aren't as set in one way as a lot of people might think. And yes, there are groups of Gnolls which, because of their nature and the way that they do things, stand out among many of their kin a lot more. And the worst of the Gnolls are the ones that people tend to remember because, well, you know, they're pretty awful a lot. So, I mean, they stand out. But we'll be going over all of them, all the different types of Gnolls, and kind of discussing them a little bit here. Anyway, so let's do this thing. Let me move me into the corner, which is away from here, where I throw up images. We'll start with that one there. Cool. So, as I normally do, I talk about some books that you can check out. This is the Classic Monsters Revisited. This will have a lot of the original stuff based on Gnolls. That tends to be your demon-worshipping slaver Gnolls that are the traditional enemies, which is a place where a lot of humanoids and stuff ended up in. But if you do want to see a little bit more on other Gnoll cultures and the evolution of them, I recommend checking out the Manga Expanse book. It does deep dive into the other groups of Gnolls, especially the ones of Grun, the Kholo, which we'll talk about today, who are, well, maybe not, they're of a different culture. They live up to basically the idealisms of what Gnoll culture is on the basics, but they don't have a lot of those tendencies that make them probably a threat. It doesn't mean you could cooperate with them or you wouldn't get into a fight with them. It's just that they have a unique cultural way of doing things a lot, so you kind of run into it there. Let's discuss the Gnoll. Actually, the other one's probably fine. We'll do the other images in a different size. I will blow my nose for a second and mute myself on stream. Technically muted on video too, but you know, I try to remember to do that. All right, Gnolls. They're also sometimes known as hyena folk. They are a humanoid race. Some of their renownedness comes in two directions. What people would know them for is either being very lazy or being very brutal in the way they do things. Whether or not a individual Gnoll would live up to this, that's an individual. They are a very big pack-based creature, though. And many Gnolls do survive by raiding, pillaging, and slaving. And so that slaving goes to that slothful idea of a lifestyle. But again, these are the Gnolls that people know about more than others. They stand out. If you look at a Gnoll, they're large, powerfully built. They have a hybrid of a humanoid hyena kind of appearance. They're a little taller, bulkier, and certainly much furrier than your average human and most humanoids. Their stance is the most humanoid feature of them all. They do have a hyena kind of like hunched to its back. Their torso is more humanoid than a hyena's, still covered in fur. They have muscular arms that have clawed hands that are just as dexterous as your average humans. Their legs have double jointed, much like that of a hyena's. It gives them kind of like a lopping, hopping gait when they run on their hind legs. Though capable of upright, they do have the ability to drop onto all fours because of their canine-like hindquarters to kind of like rush like a dog or other canine for a little bit more of a mobility. Their head, of course, is the most hyena-like feature. They have the hyena's snout, a blunt muzzle, muscular, bone-crunching jaws, black eyes, and round ears. So they have a very hyena face, definitely. So, now, let's add in a little bit of things is why you'd have an adventurer. A lot of times I do these kind of species guides in Pathfinder, these ancestries, to give you an idea about playing them and who the other humanoid races are. In this case, if you are an adventurer, many of them do leave their clans or packs to work as mercenaries or adventurers. Some like learning new skills, earning wealth, looking for allies they may benefit their people. And that's the thing, is because they aren't of a particular alignment, and that, yes, you do have the group of them, which are chaotic evil, who stand out and give the reputation that's bad. Your average Gnoll that is not part of that culture, because there's plenty of them across the world, it can really be any alignment. And there is a lot of mindset in the way that they do things that is important to note, kind of, and we'll talk about a little bit more. There are some adventuring Gnolls that have lost all their clans, either orphaned because of disaster, or maybe exiled for some reason, maybe even sought after for some kind of crime against their group. But they still do have that pack-minded tendency, so they will adopt others in their group that they form as basically honorary Gnolls in their minds, and more pack-mates. Many adventuring type Gnolls end up in classes like the Ranger, with their connections with the wilderness, but some are barbarians, fighters. If they're trickery, they become into rogues. For the Kholo, you have the Bone Keepers of Kholo, who are witches who treat their ancestral spirits as objects of worship. Well, they don't treat them... They treat them less as an object of worship and more as a colleague. And you do get some Kholo storytellers who are bards. So while those that are descended from more violent, more savage groups may find themselves in very martial ranges, the Kholo, with their probably... I couldn't say it's a more advanced culture. Different culture tends to have some more spellcasters and stuff. So if you're going to look for where you would find Gnolls across Golarion, they live in Avastia, Grund, and Casmeron. They are the most common in the deserts of Grund and Casmeron. They like hot deserts, warm plains. They can also live in warm mountains or sunny forests, and some of them even have lived underground. The most numerous places you find Gnolls are in the deserts and mountains of Kapatish, which they consider their homeland, their God-given homeland in a way. And they tolerate the other more civilized inhabitants. The Gnolls of Kapatish are so numerous, they have an entire district in the capital, which is known as Dogtown, which is obviously a little derogatory, but, you know. It's devoted to them, and because the Gnolls of Kapatish are your traditional slaver type, and again, they've had the most success there in what they consider their homeland, Kapatish likes them because the slaves they bring in, too. They can be found in deserts of Nex, Osiren, Thuvian, Rahadum. They used to be found in Geb, and in the deserts now of the Mana Waste, but the magical warfare drove them from those to seek more safe areas. They are less common in Avastia, sticking to warmer forests and plains rather than deserts. Small bands in the wilds of the River Kingdom, which are very disorganized, the Chaotic Realm areas of Galt. But some even live in Razmirin, or in parts of Kionin. They've been on decline since the fall of ancient Thassalon. They were citizens of Haruka, the domain of Kroon, the ruler of Sloth, where this idea of them seeking like a laziness was actually appreciated in the realm of Sloth. And they were kind of slave drivers within that society, scouts, observers of Kroon's armies. During Earthfall, their population was halved, and most fled to the Vriezen area to find hunting grounds. Let's talk about the other major group of Gnolls, though, that we should mention here. The Kholo. Because that's important to talk about, too. These are the Gnolls of the Mwangi Expanse. And their culture is a bit more pragmatic. You have to think of the Gnolls in a lot of the other areas of the world as descended from a similar kind of culture. They might have originated in Kapatish, but things like their connections to Thassalon and a lot of the northern kingdoms of Grund are basically descended from the same group and have that kind of mentality of the darker worships, the slave drivers, that kind of thing. But they are from many locations where those things are traditionally looked at as fine things, so they tend to fit in. And again, you can see in Capatesh, they do their best to, in their eyes, tolerate the others. But the Kholo themselves are efficient as a moral imperative. They skew concepts like honor, use ruthless ambush tactics and terror to ensure they win victory in battle. This makes them a lot of enemies and their neighbors, but they do have a respect for strong foes. A Kholo in the Mwangi Expanse can live up to 100 years, average around 60. They're divided into a number of clans that, similar to other places where there are Gnolls, but for the Kholo's case, they number between 100 and 200 people, usually between 10 and 20 family groups. They are led by a matriarchal council of each family's elders, which in turn names a chief elder to lead them. The elder is advised by the Bone Keeper, who mediates the clan's ancestors and gods, and a storyteller, who is the clan's historian, sage, and linguist. Gender rules do vary between clans, which is important to say, but Kholo women are generally the warriors and hunters, while men are often the artists, caretakers, and gatherers. Leadership is typically reserved for women, but men can become the bone keepers and storytellers, which are very important roles within society, as we talked about here. So it's sort of like, yeah, as a male Gnoll in Kholo society, at very least, and a lot of other Gnoll societies, you maybe not get away, but at least in Kholo society, there are jobs that are very important to your people that you can kind of go into that will be very respected. They're named at birth after a bone, plant, or animal. Though naming one hyena is frowned upon as kind of a narcissistic arrogance. So don't do that, They grant additional names and descriptives of their personality and as they mature and kind of things like that. So they start with this basic name and get more of them as they age. They revere their ancestors, the grand endo-cannibalistic feast upon its death of one of its own. Basically, consuming their dead is considered a sacred act, and the bones are transformed into artwork and weapons. Many of these Gnolls will carry ancestors' bones to consult them for advice. The rituals rarely include outsiders, and only those whom are admired or have prowess that the clan seeks to employ. They primarily worship Callistrae and Shellin in the names of elder and younger sister. Nethys is worshipped as the brother and patron of the Bone Keepers. They rarely worship Lamashtu, who's popular with a lot of other Gnolls, and reserve invoking her for the most dire circumstances. So that's a very interesting thing. While Lamashtu is popular and is a very evil deity amongst a lot of the other Gnolls, they worship a bunch of deities who are at most neutral, at worst good. It's very interesting. Like, Shellin is a neutral good deity. Callistrae is chaotic good, and of course, Nethys is true neutral. So you can see there is, honestly, Kholo are the group of Gnolls that really most people would want to play, because they're the easiest to say why they might be more whatever alignment. They are the people that, have good strength, but are very unique and different than a lot of them. Anyway, back to your average Gnoll, which do, in a way, sometimes include Kholo. Gnolls, no matter what environment they come from, interact with the natural world more like animals rather than humanoids. They don't try to alter the environment. They do have a vicious nature. They are good at... they are good for the surrounding environments, as they do act as scavengers. And they would wolf down rancid carrion left by other creatures. They are predators, though, too. And an average Gnoll hunter does actually very little hunting. They prefer to drive weaker predators from their kills. Though, again, when you're in a lot of the cultures in places like Capash, the prospect for more slaves is enough to rouse action if it's a situation like that. The scavenging idea can come to looting, stealing clothes, armor, weapons, even homes from others. in certain circumstances. And this leads to a reason why Gnolls are very prolific slavers. It's the idea that with the natural world, it's kind of the idea that it's not really a laziness, it's the least amount of energy. Most animals in nature will do things that require the least amount of energy. If it's too much energy, they're not going to do it. It's not really seen as laziness. But in a humanoid who has more options and has more intelligence, it's seen as a laziness trait because with their intelligence and stuff, they should be able to do more actions. In this case, they don't. They go in that kind of natural route and go for whatever's easiest. And there you go to stealing, looting, slaving, getting people to do it for you. In a lot of places, say for the Kholo for most cases, Gnolls' lives are pretty short and violent. As I said, while the Kholo have their deities, your average Gnoll in most of the other societies venerates Lamashtu. And the typical life is... there are some that don't start life as naturally born, though, and this is where the connections with Lamashtu, though, through crude, brutal cesareans as they are ripped from the womb of their tribes as a tribute to the mother of monsters. There are times when a pup may chew its way free from a mother's womb, and these vicious Gnolls are considered destined for greatness in society or powerful leaders for such violence. So, it's the violence breeds violence, and there is a very violent kind of tone to a lot of Gnolls within Avastia, Northern Grund, and Casmer. Gnoll pups are typically delivered in litters numbering between 3 to 5. They're dangerous by their 3rd year, physically maturing around their 8th year. Females are fertile between their 10th and 18th year. And in some Gnoll cultures, those who have not given birth or been favored by the goddess by age 15 are sacrificed to appease her. Important to mention, I mentioned the Kholo. Their natural lifespan is 60 years, and some can live past 100. Everywhere else, the average lifespan of a Gnoll is 28 years. Yeah, it's sort of like the Kholo have natural births, but those that worship Lamashtu specifically don't have those a lot of times because they believe in the brutality of it and the worship of it. And it just probably is, pretty awful. It's, again, a society of violence that breeds violence in a way. Most don't make it to the 30s. They die from violence. The canny most lucky can see their 40th birthday in your average Gnoll society in a lot of these places in the world. So, it's a thing that, there are a lot of Gnolls out in the world, a lot more than there are the Kholo, but the Kholo are very Gnoll in their nature. They're still part of the natural world, but they don't go to some of the extremes as it and see things in a much different tone. It's almost as if they came to the realization doing things like taking slaves from their neighbors would not be very helpful, as that would, they're very extremist in the way that they do battle with their neighbors, oftentimes honestly killing them all, because, they have the belief that in the long run, it's easier to not have anybody, rather than if they take people want to come back for revenge or liberate them or something. It just gives everybody not have an issue. And it's a kind of violent way, but they take it a very, they're very, very nature-based about it. So it is an actual very neutral stance. It's an extreme stance, in a way, but it is one that, if you break down why they make the decision, the Kholos, for a lot of things they do, it is very natural world. And again, that's similar in both sides for both your Kholo and your average Gnoll from the rest of the world. They have this natural tendencies to act very animal in a lot of their decisions. And that's not to say there probably aren't some Gnolls that have evolved beyond that, but those might be the ones that are exiles or considered criminals for actions they do. Honestly speaking, some of those criminal Gnolls might be people that, Gnolls that, whatever their origin within Gnoll society, try to rise above it. you could certainly play a thing like a Gnoll champion who's looking to like a good deity, and it has trying to like basically see a redemption for their people, who's a criminal in exile, and, you know, rose above the situation of the slavers of Kapesh and other parts of the world. So it's an unfortunate thing that there is a strength in the society of Gnolls that drive, for a lot of the world, that drives them into the direction they go in. So it's sort of like, honestly speaking, we walked away from alignment a little bit in more modern days, but those ones that would have the more wicked tendencies, the more violent tendencies, on average, are probably going to be ones from the rest of the world. And the Kholo are the ones that have basically maybe evolved to a degree, even though they haven't gotten beyond that animal nature of a Gnoll. So, pack is everything to Gnolls. Life alone is a thing that none of them would choose, and they do everything they can to travel in packs. In a smaller pack, normally you have a single male leader who takes on the lofty, pretentious title like Emperor, Consort to Lamastu, King of all Gnolls, and they kind of maintain that position through violence. But this only happens through how much they can kind of keep it within their claws. So these small packs of a few hunters, their hunting is often more like that scavenging we talked about. Yeah, they could hunt something if they need to, but they'll take advantage of situations more than anything. Gnoll tribes, even outside of the Kholo, do grow only as large as 200 normally. And you need exceptional leaders like the Carrion King, who was a sworn Grovagug. I'll show you an image of him in a minute. Gartok. I was going to put his image with the tribes and talking about them. And a leader like that can create bigger groups of Gnolls. Usually in every region where Gnolls live, there has one larger, more successful band that led by the strongest Gnoll, who has influence throughout the region. Regardless if they've actually, something like the Carrion King, you do tend to get that strength through violence in a way. Much similar to some of the other more savage races that are a little bit more savage in Golarion. Though again, there is sometimes that Gnolls can kind of get a little bit more of that civilized nature. So it's not impossible for them to raise up themselves. Just, we don't see it a lot in the societies they often have. They have a vicious nature, but an important thing about Gnolls also, and this even applies to Kholo, they see little to be gained from warring between themselves, and they never, and this is also important for non-Kholo, they never enslave other Gnolls. This is like a rule in between them. You know, don't war with each other, don't enslave each other. It's like this unspoken rule between the people. They do have, even though they are very chaotic in nature, they do have laws which revolve around the group. They are taught that the good of the pack outweighs that of the individual. These laws are deeply skewed, so no punishment. There's no punishment for killing a non-Gnoll, unless he was the packmate's slave. While forcing another Gnoll to work incurs a harsh penalty. So there are very skewed laws towards Gnoll supremacy is another thing too. At least in, Kholo have their own unique way of doing things. Again. The most punishment, of course, is exile. It's worse than death because it's condemned to endless loneliness. These exiled can then seek new companions amongst non-Gnolls. There are a bunch of them that will seek trolls, orcs, or will go out somewhere in a battle for a swift and final death. When a Gnoll is exiled, they are shaved and then scarred forever to mark them as banished. The most heinous crimes for this are forcing a Gnoll to work, basically enslaving another Gnoll, betraying Gnolls to the race's their enemies, worshipping a deity not associated with Lamashtu, fleeing a slave, are punished by exile. So these are the ones for your average ones. So you can see here, why the Kholo are very unique, because the rest of them have laws against worshipping anything other than Lamashtu. Oh, it went gray there. I hate it when it does that. And there's our good friend the Carrion King for a second here. I will use him as a nice example. So there are different Gnoll tribes, and I'll mention the most famous one here, but there are plenty of different ones. They go by various tribal. The Pale Mountain Gnolls are located near the Brazen Peaks, the barrier wall of northern Capesh. It is avoided by travelers, as this is the area that the Carrion King had ruled. He might be still alive. I don't know. Let's find out. Is the Carrion King still alive? I asked this question because I'm not sure. I guess since Hal the Carrion King, the part of the Adventure Path Legacy of Fire, he might be alive. He might have been killed in that. I would have to check through that book, but that's where he was alive at. Anyway, we were dealing with the region there where the Carrion King rules, from the Pale Mountain slopes, commanding hundreds of gnomes, his hordes and bands of raiders, slavers, murderers, and noteworthy tribes that serve him are Al, Chorvik, the Circle, Three Jaws, and Wormhollow. And lesser tribes of this area are Havor's Hunters, the Gulvis, Sordane, and Wormslavers. Again, hard names to know. So if I mess up any of those names, sorry. So yeah, I talked about the Kholo religion, and we really do have to discuss Gnolls, the rest of the world, as the majority of them are devout servants of Lamashtu. And I think that's where a lot of their problems come in. The Mother of Monsters is a very wicked deity. And that reverence of her tends to kind of fill a lot of all of their lives. And that's a reason why, you do not see many Gnolls escaping the cycle of darkness that plagues the majority of them. The worship is somewhat confliction with some of their, at least, okay, so in your, where the Kholo are more matriarchal, the rest of the Gnolls are more misogynistic, intended to find a female's role, which kind of is in conflict with Mashtu. And so females are seen as either holy priestesses or sacred mothers in their society, and if they're neither, they're to be sacrificed to Lamashtu. So yeah. So in a lot of these societies, the priesthood is split between female clerics and male shamans. The females generally perform the more ritualistic aspects of the religion, preparing sacrifices, overseeing birth, hunting down heretics. Males are more common activities like giving unholy sermons, casting healing spells. Gnoll priestesses regard themselves as mothers of their flock, as teachers and caretakers of the pack. This is not always figurative, as some of them give birth to monstrous offspring as a sacred duty, and are notoriously fecund. Because they worship a being that is the mother of monsters, sometimes they give birth to monsters. It's a thing. Many of them spend most of their life pregnant, with their distended bellies scarred with various violent births. Gnoll society outside of the Kholo is kind of a difficult one. In an attempt to mimic their goddess's form, male shamans go through a ritual trepidation to open a hole, supposedly a third mystic eye in the middle of their forehead. They sometimes will even fill this orifice they've created with stolen eyes from sacrificial victims. Lamashtu is not a great deity to worship if you want to have a great life. Not at all. But, yeah! There's the Gnolls, and we can see that there are two groups of Gnolls, really. The ones that we know about most of the time, the ones that, adventurers get in fights with, and the ones that have their notorious, honestly, worship of Lamashtu, they're slavers, they're lazy. The laziness, again, is not really laziness. It kind of is, but kind of isn't. It's a difficult thing to describe, but the slaving Lamashtu worshipping Gnolls are a big group of them. the average population, especially in places like Capital, where they are a lot of them, are going to be that. Finding an individual Gnoll, you might find an exception. And certainly, if you find someone from the Kholo, they are an exception to that. They are very different. They, might give a worship to Lamashtu, but usually in desperate circumstances. Most of the time, they live up to, let's say Shalin and Ethis. And, they have these different roles and a very much, developed existence that's very interesting. It's almost as though the Gnolls of the rest of the world were effectively corrupted by Lamashtu. And the Kholo are what Gnolls were. What Gnolls could have been. They are still creatures of nature, more than humanoids. They have an intelligence to them, but they embrace being part of the natural world a lot more. But I think that's kind of where we see it, where we can kind of break it down. That if Lamashtu hadn't gained such a powerful influence over your Gnolls, and had that influence on where they went to today, they might be very much like the Kholo. They have been corrupted by a deity. And its effect runs very deep. Very deep. It's an unfortunate thing that your average Gnoll, not part of the Kholo, has trouble getting away from. You might be exiled, you might be tormented. You might be, an orphan. You might be a criminal, have to run away. Hard to say. And it's not to say that you don't get Gnolls that are exceptions to these rules, that are outside the Kholo. I said that before, earlier. You can. It's just rare. And I feel like it's one of those things is, the Kholo are good in their spot. They're probably not going to really escape from it much. Some might journey beyond the expanse, but your average one will live there their entire lives, separated out in a different world. And that influence of them will not spread to the other Gnolls. And without something major happening, their society will remain what it is. And when places like Kapesh tolerate their behavior, because they do things for them, it just encourages it more. It doesn't let them evolve beyond it. And it tells you something about Capetish's civilization. The negatives of it. And many other places in Northern Durand. In places like Osirian, where things are beginning to change, where things like slavery are beginning outlawed, then you're beginning to separate out things from like the Gnolls, which might wander those deserts there. And those become an outline. They become something which finds that place honestly hostile and dangerous, where they could move to something. If they find themselves with nowhere to go in the world, that might be the opportunity to force a change. But as long as there's places where they can ply their trade, where they can feel their superiority, where they can feel their justifications for their dark worships, they'll never go. They'll never change. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed today. Diving into the Gnolls is an interesting one because they are, like many of the more considered savage species of Golarion, there is a core of hope for something a little bit more civilized. And certainly, like, the Kholo still will have different difficulties with a lot of other humanoid races just because of the nature of a lot of stuff they do. But at the very least, there's that interaction chance, which makes it interesting. So I will be back. Okay, now let me do this. Thank you for joining. If you want to see more of this stuff, normally I do this every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday mornings. We'll be off this Saturday morning, but that's scheduled with it, going to a convention. Packs up here. But, hey, I'm dating this a little bit. But if you want to see those on Tuesdays, Thursdays, they're early afternoon. Around 1 to 2, I stream the game. Stream these things and then put them up live afterwards. English! What was I going to say? Saturdays are a little bit more aimed towards 11, a little more on time if I'm going to do that, because I need to be because of scheduling on most days. Anything else to shout out? Wednesday evenings is the Crimson Queen Pathfinder 1st edition game. Check it out. It's very fun. Saturdays, discussing tabletop. Again, this one probably going to be off this week that I'm streaming this. Maybe I'll have it. I haven't just figured that out if it's going to fit the schedule or not yet. Where we talk about tabletop stuff. And then I do gaming stuff too. All the tabletop stuff. Not the gaming stuff goes up on YouTube days later. I have a Discord, Twitter.com for social medias. And, yes, always remember, for Twitter, following's great. YouTube, subscription, leaving a comment if you played a Gnoll or what your interactions with Gnolls have been. That's the question for the day. And then also things like, lightning, ring the bell, and all that stuff is really good for support on both of those two things. So, hey. Alright, I'm going to get going. I think I gave all the shout-outs I usually give, so I'm going to say, for now, farewell to all. Have yourselves a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time. Farewell.